Hello and welcome to a novel review, a book podcast. My name is Seamus, I'm the host, and this is a book podcast. I do what it says on the tin. I do a different book every week, 52 books a week a year, week in, week out. I'm here having a good time. I'm having a good time. Hopefully you guys are having a good time as well. And today on the podcast, I'm going to be discussing Aaron Kreuter's book, Rubble Children, 7.5 stories. So it's basically a book that's told through 7.5 interlinked stories, which I think is a really interesting way to do a book, to write a book, to tell a story. So we'll get to that in a moment. But first, I just want to say, how are you guys? How are we going? It is Christmas next week. Can you believe it? That is absolutely wild to me. I mean, this year has absolutely flown, which is terrifying in one sense, but also absolutely wonderful in another sense, because I guess that means I've had a good year. But also, I love Christmas time. I mean, it's such a wonderful time of year. The tree is behind the camera. I won't turn the camera around because I won't bore you guys with that. But first, I just want to say, if you would like to like and subscribe, I'd greatly appreciate that. If you would like to click the duck in the corner, I'd greatly appreciate that. If you would like to suggest a book, I'd also appreciate that as well. Comment it or send me an Instagram. I've had quite a few recently, which has been absolutely fantastic, and I can't make any promises that I'll be able to get to them all because I was just sketching out sort of a rough plan on what books I'm going to do, because I have a different kind of approach I want to take next year to the books I select, and I'll speak more about that in another episode in 2 weeks' time. But it basically means that I've already got every book selected until March at this stage, which seems it just seems absolutely wild that, I have already selected every book I'm going to read between now and March 2025, which just seems so far away, but it's actually not that far away. I don't know which is scarier. But the point of that was, please suggest books. I'm sure everyone else reading the comments would greatly appreciate that as well, so we can get little sort of list of books going. I do take every book on board and have a list in my phone so that whenever I go into a bookshop, I do have a list that I can look for. I greatly appreciate that. Thank you so much. I do try to get to all of them, especially if they sound really good. Sometimes I have to bump them up the order if they sound really, really interesting. This book today actually comes from my friend in Canada who works in publishing. So I pretty much trust her blindly because she always has great recommendations, and today is no different. Normally, right about now, I do a mantelpiece moment where I talk about something to highlight from the week past, but gonna skip that this week. Going to skip that in lieu of a different kind of conversation, and you can let me know your thoughts in the comments if you'd like to. I don't know if I have a solid answer for this because I don't know if there is a solid answer for this, but I basically wanted to ask the question, what is a novel? This question, I guess, originally comes from my university days when I was in my third year at university. I was doing this class, Literature and the Novel, and it was probably my favorite literature class for my undergraduate, mostly because it was the only literature class I had where we spent more than 1 week discussing the book. Every other class, from first year to third year, you'd read a book a week, discuss that book in that week's tutorial, and that would be the end of it. So basically, you're reading a book a week, and if you're doing multiple English classes like I was, you're reading more than one book a week because every class requires a book a week. Then I was doing 2 ancient history classes as well, which is a healthy amount of reading involved in that. So there was a lot of reading involved, and it got a bit overwhelming at times. But this was the only class, Literature and the Novel was the only class where we'd spend 2 weeks on one book, which is also really nice because a 1 hour tutorial is not enough time to discuss a book, especially like one of the books I read was Handmaid's Tale, and that like a 1 hour class is just not enough time to discuss that book in depth. So having 2 weeks to discuss the book was really, really good. But it was also a really good class because the whole point of the class was what constitutes a novel. Is it something like a word count? Is it something else? What actually constitutes what a novel is? The word count, most people say it's 40,000 words is sort of the cutoff, and it's a rough cutoff because it's kind of that old paradox of, if you have a mountain of sand and, the mountain consists of 10,000 grains of sand and you take 1 grain away, is it still a mountain? The obvious answer, yes, it is. You take 2 grains away, still a mountain, yes. 3 grains, yes, and so on and so forth. But eventually you've taken away enough grains that mountain no longer exists anymore, to the point that you ask, well, okay, at which point did that stop being a mountain? If we're only taking away a grain of sand every time, at some point it had to have stopped being a mountain. It's kind of the same thing with like the drinking age as well. Like it seems absolutely baffling that you can be 17 years, 364 days 23 hours, 59 minutes, and it's absolutely illegal to drink, and a minute later you're allowed to be absolutely smashed off your head in public. Kind of baffling, but I guess you just have to draw the line somewhere. And so it's kind of the same with a novel. If 40,000 words is the cutoff, is a book that's 40,000 words versus 39,999 more a novel than the previous one? So it's a really, really fun question. And one of the week's questions was, is it story-based? Is it story-based about what constitutes a novel? And the book we did that week was Julian Barnes' History of the World in 10.5 chapters. And the whole point was, well, this is 10.5 chapters. They're interlinked. They were less interlinked than this book, I will say, because the only common thread from memory in that book was, I think it was the woodworm that appears in every single chapter. And so did that constitute a novel? And so, I mean, the point of this was, I don't think I really have an answer as to what constitutes a novel. And I don't think we really need a strict answer for what constitutes a novel, because it might then become too limiting, because I felt like this was as much as a novel as anything I've ever read. Maybe this felt like more of a novel because there were characters that sort of popped up and it did have a really community feeling to it. I will sort of describe what the book is actually about in a second, but I think it sort of depends on the story. Obviously, if there's 7.5 stories that are not interlinked, it's probably a book of short stories. But in this case, where they are interlinked, taking place in the same suburb, in the same country, revolving around pretty similar issues in every single one, I'd consider it a novel. So let me know what you think. What do you think constitutes a novel? Is it a word count? Is it the story? Is it something else entirely? Is it the way the story is presented? Does it have to come in a rectangle A4, not A4, A5 kind of size? Does that constitute a novel as well? So let me know your thoughts. I'd definitely be happy to hear them. I think I better get into the book itself. Rubble Children. Normally about this time, I do a very dodgy overview as to what the book was about. And every week I think I say it was really difficult to sum up this week, and this week is no different. And I think it's even harder this week because they are 7.5 interlinked stories, but because they're interlinked, they're not really related in the way that you can give like a concise overview of what the book is. So I'm just going to read the first few lines of the back because someone's been paid to do this, and why should I deny them their moment in the sun? In 7.5 interlinked stories, Aaron Kreuter's Rubble Children tackles Jewish belonging, settler colonialism, Zionism and anti-Zionism, love requited and unrequited, and cannabis culture, all drenched in suburban wonder and dread. Sometimes realist, sometimes not, the book revolves around Kol Baseder, a fictional Reform synagogue in the Toronto suburb of Thornhill. It goes on to explain what the stories are about in a bit more depth, but I think that's such a great way of putting it, all drenched in suburban wonder and dread, because this book really does feel like a suburban fever dream of like my own sort of, not childhood, I guess, because a lot of the characters are sort of between the age of, I think, 13 and adult, but that sort of teen period. It does really feel like I was revisiting myself in some of these stories, which was, I think, probably the highlight for me. I think I really, really loved it for that reason. A bit of backstory for this. I was flying home a few weeks ago from Sydney to London. There'd been a few delays, so I was on the second flight from Singapore to London, and I was absolutely exhausted. I hadn't slept in about 40 hours at that stage. And I thought, well, what shall we do? We should start reading the book. So I hadn't opened this book yet, hadn't started reading it, and I decided to pick it up and start reading it. And the point of that was, it was a very, I think, dangerous time to start reading a book. When you're that exhausted on a plane, you're probably not going to, I guess, be drawn into a book because it's a pretty uncomfortable spot to be. But the point of this was, I read the first paragraph and I was instantly hooked. And I'm going to read it for you now because I think it does so much to explain how good this book actually is. So this is from the first story, Morning Rituals, and this is the first paragraph. When our father died, one by one, we took every piece of our life, shook it, threw it against the wall, screamed at it, discarded it, tried to move on. It started while he was sick and dying in the hospital, reached its height during the last few weeks, the coma, and once he died, it peaked, the grief and anger with the power and force of a flooding sea, washing everything away, leaving us clean, unencumbered, clear-eyed, vulnerable. Our father died, and there was suddenly nothing left to hold us in place. I mean, you're 40 hours sleep deprived on a plane. You haven't slept. You haven't had a good meal in ages because you're eating the the gruel they serve you on a plane. And you read something like that, and I was instantly hooked. I think something that really helped with this is because it's 7.5 stories and there's plenty of breaks in between, you never feel like you're stretched too far to go to the next sort of chapter or the next sort of break in story. But the first story itself, I think, was only sort of like 8 pages, so it didn't feel like that big a commitment to sort of read through, because obviously I was incredibly tired at that stage. But I mean, that opening paragraph really just sort of, like, it took the wind out of me. I was like, wow, this is really good. And I think it does so much to explain how much of a good writer he is, how much of a talented writer he is, because in this opening paragraph, you can see just the control that he has. And it's really important that an author has control over his text, because it means he understands the story, he understands what's going on, he understands what needs to be felt. He or she, of course. I'm just simply saying he because it's a male author in this instance. But it just sort of highlights the control they have over everything. So, like, the father has died in this, and that's the opening line, when our father died. And from that, we can sort of feel like a real sharpness to it. And it's really, you can see it through these sort of listicle sentences that he has, and the complete lack of the word and. We took every piece of our life, shook it, threw it against the wall, screamed at it, discarded it, tried to move on. And later in the paragraph, we've got this next sort of listicle sentence. With the power and force of a flooding sea, washing everything away, leaving us clean, unencumbered, clear-eyed, vulnerable. There's a complete lack of the word and it makes it this really sharp and declarative sentence that really sort of highlights how stripped these people are feeling at this moment. They've lost their father, the sort of head of the family, and they don't know how to go and they don't know how to navigate. And so they're sort of reduced back to the bare minimum of just expressing these emotions, leaving us clean, unencumbered, clear-eyed, vulnerable. They don't know how to sort of express themselves because their father's gone. And you get the sense that he was kind of the rudder of the family, because he would be the sort of ands between the words. He was the person that joined them all together and linked them all up. And so it's a really, I think, beautiful and perfect opening sort of paragraph to not only this particular story, but the entire book itself, because it really kind of sets the tone as to how much control is being threaded throughout this story. And you can really see it throughout the rest of the story as well. Like a lot of this, like I said, a lot of this story takes place in the suburbs, in suburbia. And I think that's a really, I guess, fun thing to do, because I think a lot of people would think that suburbia is quite boring, and that's why we get a lot of sort of like murder mysteries and stuff like that going on in the lazy suburban towns. But Aaron Kreuter takes the sort of mundane and monotony of daily life and just crafts these really beautiful stories. And I think what really makes them fun, at least for me, was I could really see myself in them at this age and remember what I was like at that age, and what characters were like at that age, the people that I met were like at that age. And I think that's sort of another area where he really excels, is all the characters in this book sort of have their own individual personality, which really helps them leap off the page. But there's also like a healthy amount of side characters in this book, and they are formed enough that you can picture them, but I think he doesn't form them perfectly so that they're incredibly sharp, so that you yourself as the reader actually project some of your own experiences into those characters, so that you read a character and you go, oh, he reminds me of, that person from my own personal past. And you project a lot of that into the character itself, which then sort of like creates this really nice bond between you and the text and the stories that are going on. And it just sort of like really elevates the experience. And I think I just had a lot of fun reading it for that, because it did make me feel very nostalgic and loving of that time. Really, just nostalgic for that time and what it was like to be growing up sort of in the suburbs, and what that meant, and what it was like during, I guess, for me, the sort of early, late-ish 2000s. And when he was writing this, I think it's 2003. So it was, kind of a few years difference between me and the characters, but very similar time periods, I still feel. But it's also a really interesting time for kids that age, between the ages of sort of like 13 and an adult, because that's when you sort of start to form you start to get like an opinion on the world. You start to develop mentally and have these experiences where you start to understand the world in a better way. And that's what a lot of these stories are about. They're sort of coming of age, but they're not necessarily coming of age in like just growing up and kissing a girl for the first time or something like that. There's one particular story where these young Jewish girls are really obsessed with the Holocaust, and they can't understand why like no one else is as obsessed. And they go out and have this experience, and they learn that the entirety of human history is just a a graveyard for human pain and suffering, and that while the Holocaust is an absolute abhorrent crime on humanity, there have been many, many, many crimes on humanity. And it's sort of really, it's a really, I think, timely story, because this particular story is about halfway through the book. But it's a really kind of timely story because all these stories are about Jewish kids growing up and sort of learning and developing as individuals, but also understanding what it means to be part of Judaism, the religion, and what that means to be considered part of the state of Israel. And there's a lot of characters that are very for the state of Israel and a lot of characters that are not for the state of Israel and would prefer a two-state solution with the Palestinians, which is, of course, very timely to what's going on now. And that sort of, I think, brings an emotional intensity to this book. But it's just that kind of like experience of, growing up, and some kids go one way and some kids go the other way. And, only 2 years ago, we were all playing in the park, like playing with dirt and stuff. But now suddenly we've got these opinions and these different experiences that are shaping and forming us as individuals. And it's sort of, how do you navigate these different familial politics that are going on? Because, our grandfather he's seen certain things that are abhorrent and he shouldn't have had to suffer through, but that's sort of like carrying through to now, and he can't separate then from now. And do you need to separate then from now? And it just asks all these really, really big questions in a very, I think, clear and concise, but also very sparse way, and that it doesn't feel like it's just saturating the text with these questions. It does feel very, very natural, and I think very kind to the reader, in that it's not an overly political book for that sense, that it's not just like trying to throw something down your throat. It's not trying to force something down your throat. It's actually just kind of like presenting these ideas and these different characters and letting them have different conversations with each other that lets you have a really nice experience with the text and bring your own opinion, that you could sort of be on one side or the other and still quite enjoy the text. So I really sort of appreciated that it didn't just become this really dense political sort of, I guess, mouthpiece for what's going on. That's not a comment on anything that's going on at all. It's just sort of one of those things that sometimes you don't want to read a book and just be like hammered home with a certain opinion. That Aaron Kreuter really does give his character sort of different lives and different personalities, I think is really true to life and does elevate this text in a wonderful, wonderful way. And that's probably, this is probably the last thing I'll touch upon before I finish, is I spoke a few weeks ago about writing a dialogue, and how tricky it is to get right, because you want dialogue to feel like it's natural, but obviously dialogue on a paper is very different from dialogue spoken in the real world. And so you have to sort of find that balance between being manufactured, but also retaining a naturality to it. And I think Aaron Kreuter does it really well, because especially writing about teenagers, I think can be an incredibly difficult thing to do when you're not a teenager. And I think, I know Aaron Kreuter's a bit older than me, so he's a bit further away from those teen years, but he still manages to find that naturality to teenager conversation that is just sort of like random and fickle and drenched in sort of ideas, but also just like puberty's coming through, puberty's affecting, hormones are coming through, girls are liking boys, boys are liking girls. We're sort of developing in different ways, and all these wonderful things that sort of infiltrate the everyday language that teenagers are speaking. He sort of really manages to capture in this book. So I really loved and appreciated that as well, because it did feel very much like a snapshot into my own past, into, I'm sure, a lot of people's past. I'm sure a lot of people read this and find sort of common ground with it for that sense. So I really, really loved that. I think I'll stop talking about it there, because otherwise I'll just keep rambling, and I can't, because it's really difficult to speak about 7.5 stories without going in depth about them. What would I rate this out of 5? That's a really good question. I think I would rate this. I think I'm going to give it a 4.4, because it was pretty good, and I read through it pretty quickly because it just felt very, very natural. It was a really nice book to read. It was like a little trip down memory lane. So I'd recommend it for that. Aaron Kreuter's Rubble Children, 7.5 stories. Okay, so what was I reading this week? Well, this week I have started reading the next fantasy series that I'm doing. I announced it 2 weeks ago on the His Dark Materials 3rd episode, The Amber Spyglass. I'm reading Mervyn Peake's Gormenghast trilogy, and the first book is Titus, Groan. I had no idea what these books were going to be about, and I've done a bit of research now because I'm 100 pages in, and I'm like, what the hell is this book? It's absolutely wildly Not even wild though. Wild is the wrong word. It's absolutely fantastic in a very different kind of way. It's very speculative. There are no elves, there's no magic, there's sort of like kings and queens, I guess, in one sense, but there's no sort of, I was about to say there's no power struggles. My goodness. No, there are power struggles, but it's just not very dense fantasy in that kind of a way, in that there's, big sword fights and everything like that. It's really just about sort of like how this one family is sort of going about their business within this giant castle. And when I say giant castle, I mean like really, really big. Like, I think they never leave the castle. But one thing is shining through. I mean, the story is still quite nice to read, and it's rather kind of comedic for that reason, that there are no sword fights and power struggles of that sort of nature. But one thing is really, really shining through is the writing style. The writing is just sublime. It's absolutely out of this world. It's fantastic. It's some of the nicest writing I think I've ever read, because it just carrying you through. Like I said, I'm 112 pages in and nothing's really happened yet, but I'm so okay with that because it's really nice and I'm just flowing with it really well. And I always finish the episode with a quote, and I'm going to read a quote just to give you a taste, so hang around for that. But before I get to that, I just want to say thank you so much for listening. I hope you've enjoyed the episode. I hope you've enjoyed it enough to hit the duck in the corner if you're on YouTube, or like and subscribe on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, wherever you get your podcast from. Please feel free to even hit the like button or the 5 stars. I'd also really appreciate that. You can head to the website and support the pod in other ways. But as always, just thank you so much for listening. I really do appreciate it. So here to take us away, a quote from Titus Groan, and this is about a baby. And I mean, this quote is fantastic, and this just highlights how good the writing style is. So here we go. Kreuter entered the room. Her bare feet made no noise on the floor. When Mrs. Slag reached the cradle, she put her fingers to her mouth and peered over it as though into the deepest recesses of an undiscovered world. There he was, the infant Titus. His eyes were open, but he was quite still. The puckered up face of the newly born child, old as the world, wise as the roots of trees. Sin was there, and goodness, love, pity, and horror, and even beauty, for his eyes were pure violet. Earth's passions, Earth's griefs, Earth's incongruous, ridiculous humours, dormant yet visible in the wry pippin of a face.